deliberately not tied to a particular tech, although I'll be up front. I'm a React guy, so you're going to be seeing React examples at a few points. But almost everything here is agnostic. Who in here is working in React? Hi, everybody. Wow. How about Angular? Okay. Vue? So Vue and Angular are about even in here, not very many. Ember? Usually there's one. not one. Svelte, who's doing Svelte? One, dang. According to Twitter, Svelte is hot, but according to conferences, I can't find people doing it. Yeah, I don't know what's going on there. So we're gonna talk about building reusable components. And to set the stage on this, I am Cory. I am an independent consultant specializing in React. I've been doing basically React since it came out, since it was open sourced. Before that I was in Angular, but once I saw React, I just really wanted to switch. I loved the JavaScript-centric setup. I'm one of the weird people that like JSX right away, although a lot of people did come around on that. Before Angular, it was Knockout, and before that, jQuery, MooTools, all sorts of other things before that. These days, I'm spending a fair amount of time helping companies build component libraries. So if you're in here, you're obviously interested in the idea of reusable components, but I want to be clear that if you're working in any modern JavaScript framework or library, you're probably creating reusable components. Maybe they're only reusable within your app. That's totally relevant to what I'm talking about here too. So I'm curious though, how many of you in here are working at a company that has a reusable component library that is shared across projects today? Lots of people. That's probably 70% of the room. Okay, so, and these are the sorts of teams that I'm working with a lot. So I'll start with a little story. Had a company reach out to me just 2 or 3 months ago that was in bad shape. They had started a component library, and they spent multiple months trying to stand the whole thing up. They got behind schedule. They finally realized that the only way they were going to ship their project was to more or less abandon the idea of thinking reusable components and just write code as fast as you could. So they ended up in this awkward spot where they had some half-baked reusable components and a lot of components inside of an application that theoretically could be reusable to some degree, but were never really written with that in mind. When it comes to reuse, I like to think about it as the hardest part of front-end development. I think of writing reusable components as front-end development in hard mode. And by that I mean, as software developers, we're really used to writing software that solves a problem that is outlined, that you've got a design and you can envision the user, and you might even have personas, and you've got some Figma to go reference, and you have tickets that say what the acceptance criteria is. The problem is, with a reusable component library, you are writing code for people you haven't met to solve problems you haven't seen. And that makes it much harder. That means that I can't merely look at some ticket or trust some Figma and say that I'm covering my bases. And in my experience, this is part of why I've focused so much on reusable components in my career over the last few years. It's an area that's close to my heart because I see it as a way that we all move forward, is by standing on the shoulders of giants. And sometimes those giants are awesome open source projects like Material UI or React Bootstrap. Sometimes those projects are internal component libraries that we're sharing together. But this recognition of saying somebody did good work and they put in the time and care to create something that isn't merely solving their problem, but they're striving to solve all of our problems. That's a wonderful thing. So this team that reached out to me, they said, okay, so can you come help us out, because we really don't know how to move forward now, because we spent months on it and we really don't have much to show for it. It didn't work, and we need to figure out why. So I want to start by framing exactly why I think that is. One reason that they failed that was obvious to me was they had a balancing act that all of you also feel, which is this balancing act between I want to write good reusable components so that we can use them again, and I got to finish before the end of the sprint. All of us are dealing with this trade-off that occurs of fulfilling what I need to do in the moment in time versus making my manager happy this week that I finish this ticket. They obviously over-indexed on today and they sacrificed tomorrow. So the first thing that I realized was the reason that they failed fundamentally was they didn't have anybody that was full-time dedicated to the reusable component library. What they did was they told developers, go build reusable components in this new library and share them on NPM, and while you're doing that, you need to ship this new app. And by the way, every couple weeks we're going, why isn't the app ready? Why isn't the app ready? And I'm really fixated on why isn't the app ready because we've got a deadline we got to hit. So when management tells you what they want you to do, when they show their priorities, believe them. And management very clearly said the app was more important than the components. In my experience, I've worked with a lot of companies. Foundational here, if you want to have a component library that is shared across projects, you need to pay somebody a salary so that it exists. And when I say somebody, probably multiple people. So years ago, I was working at Cox Automotive. Cox Automotive, you might not have heard of, but they own Kelley Blue Book. They own Auto Trader. They own Vin Solutions. They own a lot of different software related to the automotive industry. And I'm a car guy, so I loved working there. When we were working there, we started out with just me building a reusable component library. And I got a little ways along, but it was really clear that I couldn't keep up because once I'd gotten the first few components out, you become a victim of your own success. People come along and they say, I really like that, but I need it to do this. Or it turns out there's a bug over here. Did you look at this accessibility issue? I need this new prop. All this stuff starts to mean now it's like any other popular open source project. Well, I wanted to keep adding new things, but now all I can do is constantly respond to pull requests and different features that people want to add. So we added to the team, added 1, added 2, added 3. By the time that we hit peak, we had 7 people on a reusable component team. Now is there anybody in here that has 7 people working on a reusable component team? 1. Oh, wow. Where do you work? Must be a big place. Sorry, I couldn't hear you. PwC? I've seen their letters on the sides of buildings, so I know they're big. Yeah, okay. So you might think 7 developers, that sounds absurd. Like that's a lot of money in salaries. Worth it. By the time that I left, we had shipped over 100 React applications across the company using that component library. That's a lot of value because that's 100 different applications that didn't have to build a date picker and a time picker and figure out a tab control and cover all these form edge cases that we had just built in to our forms library. That's also programmatic foundation for our design system. We knew we have a design system and we want to enforce it using code. So I'm curious in here, what are team sizes? Now I'm just asking, just so everybody can see, you might want to look around. So who in here has a component library that's used by multiple teams? Because that's really who I'm speaking to at the moment. So it's about 1/3 of the room here. And how many of you have full-time staff dedicated to that reusable component library? Ooh. And that's where I look. That is really risky. A reusable component library is like any other piece of software. It is not ever done. Now, I recognize you can think of pieces of software that actually are done to a degree. They have wonderful test coverage. They solve a problem that is timeless. But it's that thing right there. I said timeless. Reusable components are not timeless. They tend to reflect the current trends and realities within user experience, within design, and also, unfortunately, whoever your current designers are. When design loses a team member and somebody new comes in, they tend to want to do what developers do and say the old stuff is crap. That's really common. So you can end up rewriting components over time. So I'm a big fan of reusable components because as society advances, we can take more things for granted. And if you give me a good component library, there's all sorts of things that I can take for granted. A good component library ends up enforcing the things that I used to have to remember. Kent's talk this morning talking about don't spend your time trying to solve problems, but actually see if you can avoid the problem altogether. That happens in a good component library. Take a simple example. We know if I take a label and I put an HTML input under that label, what attribute do I need to put on the label for accessibility purposes? 4. And how many of you have been doing that consistently your whole career? Like, does nobody not want to raise their hands? That's terrifying. It's, I will say I didn't know about it for years. And that's just one little issue. Accessibility is a big tent. With a reusable component library, you actually don't have to know that because your component library can abstract that away, and it can require me to put an ID on an input, and then it can tie that label to the input for me. That's a very simple example, but that's the power of a component library. The other big power of a component library is reducing decision fatigue. As a modern developer, the number of decisions that we have to make is absurd. And this slide, as it rolls down here, yeah, the text is small. The text is small because I was trying to fit a lot of points, but this is not even comprehensive. This is not all the decisions that one needs to make when they're creating reusable components. It's some. I mean, even at its very basis, on the top left-hand side, it says core technology. We know that in here there's a number, and is anybody in here doing native web components? 2 hands. 3 hands. This is an area where I was really excited 10 years ago. And it's really sad that I have to say that. Like a decade ago, I was excited about the topic. And I continue going to conferences and asking who's doing it, and hardly anybody is. If you're not familiar with native web components, there's a reason you're not. They're just not catching on. And that could be a separate conference talk, but I would say in short, it's because the developer experience isn't as compelling as some of these JavaScript frameworks, and those JavaScript frameworks have this very big advantage, which is they can innovate every single day, whereas web components is a standard that's baked into the browser, and obviously because of that, they have to honor that standard, so it limits them to a degree. You can do things like add libraries on top of it, but then you're slowly moving away from just using the standard, so it's a nuanced conversation. And I say this as somebody who's frustrated because I had a vision of us all being here in this room 10 years later, and we all share each other's components. There's no longer a conversation about, oh darn, yours is in Vue and mine's in Angular. It's a shame that we're there, but that's where we are. I look at this list and I find it intimidating, and this is precisely why I say you need a team to support this sort of thing, and probably more than one. What you're looking at is 50 decisions. And all of these decisions are not particularly easy to make either. It means that people are going to be having conversations that are somewhat religious in nature. It can hurt people's feelings. And that's understandable. I have definitely felt this sort of thing before on teams. And as somebody that teaches, when I do live sessions, I deal with this too. We have to make these basic decisions so that we can all cover together. But the beauty of the component library is it standardizes so much of this stuff. And there's lots of good reasons to write reusable components. Here's just the primary ones: consistency, less code, faster development, fewer bugs. I said that we were going to talk about how to write reusable components that are truly reusable. So I want to show a few things that I see as table stakes today. And to do that, I need to tell my Mac to mirror like this. Did that work? That did work. Hey, there's my calendar, everybody. Busy week. Oh, there's another calendar. Let's see if I can find what I'm actually wanting to show you here. I thought I had, here we go. So docs. Docs are absolutely essential for a good component library. So these are docs that I created for a client over the last year or so in a component library. I started from scratch, and it took many months to put all this together. And I pulled this up just to emphasize that one of the core decisions that you need to make is, how are you going to handle your docs? The easiest thing that you could do is pull up Storybook and slap things in there. Storybook is a wonderful tool. Storybook, though, has some obvious downsides, not the least of which is it's going to look like Storybook. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but just recognize this looks branded. This uses company branding. It's got a brand name. And that's one thing that I would emphasize. If you're wanting truly reusable components across projects, brand it like a product, because it is a product. You need to come up with a catchy name. You need to get a logo. You need to promote it amongst the company, have a Teams channel for support, do conference talks internally to promote it from time to time, build relationships, because the fact is there's always going to be developers at your company that are tempted to just do it themselves instead of use this, because this, who knows, is this really good? Will this serve all my needs? Maybe it'll slow me down. And if I go over here under components, there's some basic things that we need here. We need obviously the name, but we want a short description to describe exactly what the component is. We might want to group them by category. And we also want to provide an easy way to be able to contribute if there's something in here that you don't see. And when I go on to any of these, being able to see demos is important as well. Demos of different types. Having names for these demos. Being able to see the code for those demos. Being able to size those demos. All important. And hopefully get your z-index right, but I'm on a branch. Don't worry, this will be fixed soon. Yeah. I was just doing that to test y'all. You passed. Another thing that's key, this idea of related components. If you want people to use the right component, then it's really important to surface related components. Now, I want you to keep in mind, again, I said Storybook is the easy thing to do, but I want to draw attention to a number of the things I'm doing here that justify the fact that I created custom docs here. The other thing that I have here is related components, and that's another thing that theoretically you could do in Storybook. It'd just be a question of how you kind of hack it in, because Storybook has this mindset of it's a component and it shows a demo. But sure, you could put other stuff in the info tab, for instance, or have your own base component that maybe requires some of this. There's ways around it. While I'm thinking about it, the other thing that's important that I see a lot of companies miss is this. Notice I have imports up here, and the imports are important. People tend to often just show the body of the demo, but if the demo isn't copy and pastable into my code, that's a problem. I want to be able to just take it, it runs, and now I start changing it for my needs. That's useful. Of course, props are important. Now I'm using the props term here, which doesn't apply to everybody else, but in React, props are arguments to a component. It's how you configure it. And it is important for people to know not just what the prop is, but maybe what the actual type is. And in fact, so behind the scenes, this component library is built using TypeScript. And as a side note, I would also say that's basically table stakes right now. If you're building a component library, it should be written in TypeScript. And there's some good reasons for that. For one thing, you get amazing autocomplete support for all your users. And it's guaranteed to be right because it's generated from your code. And I say that as somebody who was telling people not to bother with TypeScript not that long ago. I feel like the tide turned to the point that I changed my mind. And it's not that I'm against types either. I have a long history in Java and C#. But just in JavaScript for a long time, I was just fine with the dynamic nature. But I'm realizing now that there's a lot of benefits to TypeScript in this particular scenario too. And I say that because one of the other teams that I work with has built a component library that is sort of a sister library to this, because it's such a large company. There's actually 2 different component libraries for 2 different sort of business units because they're significantly different. They have different needs for their components. But we share components between those teams, which is super interesting. In fact, if you looked at the code base behind the scenes, what you'd find is a lot of the code that I wrote is actually just wrapping their components. There's nothing wrong with that. It adds very little overhead. And then I get to decide when I want to take their new versions. If I want to upgrade, that's fine. But this way, they've done the same thing on their side. If I create a component on my side and they like it, they take it and use it on their side. They wrap the component. And then they don't own all that code, but they get to put their own documentation front end, do those sorts of things. So recognize some companies, they get that big that it makes sense. It's also helpful to group parent and child props together. This component is an example of exactly that. I showed you this alert right here. So alert is composed of a parent and a child, that you've got an alert component, which is basically this box and the little icon over here. And then alert item is what holds this content here in the middle, because you could have multiple children. So notice I have the alert props listed right here, but as I scroll down, now I have alert item props. It's another one of those things. Storybook recently added support for getting this done, but you do have to do some extra work to wire it up. So ask yourself, are you properly gluing those two together so that people can put them to use? Then down below, this is another area that's easy to overlook, is usage. Showing people how to use it, showing what it looks like in different contexts, explaining what those different props do, and then showing the design and labeling the different sections of that component. And also, as you do so, again, specifying the related props that make it happen. Another important area I want to draw attention to is, if I go back out a bit and come over here to resources, release notes. Release notes are huge for anybody that wants to consume your application. Having a link to the PR so that they can actually look at the code that's changed, because your consumers are developers. So they're going to be happy to go in there and potentially look at the code and say, okay, you said you did this, but let me look at how you did this. Maybe I need to better understand exactly what is shifted under my feet. And also being a good steward of semantic versioning, recognizing that it is breaking, feature, fix. That's the way to think about the three numbers. Breaking is the big number, feature is the middle number, fix is the bottom. And this means that you should avoid things like romantic versioning. Like Angular, I think, is guilty of this still. Like Angular is on 13, but does that mean they've had 13 breaking releases? Or are they doing romantic versioning where we put out another big release number just because it sounds exciting? Now, given that, you could say that's a good thing too, because you want to minimize breaking releases. And when it comes to breaking releases, this project has had 5. That's why we're on version 5 right now. I wish the number was lower, but one of those breaking releases had hardly anything in it. Like, I cringed a bit to call it a breaking release, but yes, we fixed a typo in a prop's name. But that's a breaking release, because it means whoever was using that component had a typo in their code, and they will have to fix that typo. So that's what I mean by semantic instead of romantic. The romantic side of me said, this is silly. I'll just call it a fix. But it's not a fix. So I'll say this is a balancing act too, because I have found stakeholders at the business freak out when they see breaking releases and go, oh man, and this is a big mistake I've seen some of my clients make, where they try to say, all right, breaking releases are a big deal, so we're only going to allow them once or twice a year. You can have it in June and have it in January. And that tends to just mean that people have to deal with pain longer. And it tends to build up a bunch of whip too, because you're going, I'd really like to get these changes out now, but I've got to wait to fix these API problems until January, and why? So I don't recommend that. Instead, I recommend having conversations with placeholders, with stakeholders, I should say. The other thing to notice in here is, notice I can click on any of these in the release notes, and I am taken to the component, being friendly about that sort of thing too, so people can quickly jump in and see these things. I also want to point out that these release notes are not programmatically generated. And I know this is the sort of thing that as a programmer, you would think, well, yeah, you should be doing that. The reason they're not is I don't think it's possible to do well. To programmatically generate release notes means that you have to have wonderfully written commit messages in your repository. And that means effectively every day, every commit message that you make, you've got to be thinking about that. Or then you've got to go back and rewrite history if you made that mistake. I think it's more work to do that than to merely go in and write the release notes, keep them brief. There's other things too. Half the things that I do in this project have zero impact on any users because I upgraded some build tool that makes all this happen. I'm using a newer version of ESLint to check my code. That doesn't affect you, but it is part of the repository because the repository that holds the components also, of course, serves those components and helps me build them. So I've seen a lot of component libraries put everything in their release notes. I don't recommend that. Like the release note shouldn't say, we fixed a typo in a comment. Nobody cares about a typo in a comment if they're consuming your components. They care about behaviors. So that's key. Also notice just little things like making sure that you have mobile support here because people tend to have the docs open and squeeze them off to one side. I tried to punt on that for a while and then realized that was a bad idea because I thought, well, you're at a company, you're running a big desktop. No, people want to squeeze it off to one side and reference it that way. Okay, so there are lots of decisions, but there are 10 that I think are most important, which are these. Now, I'm not going to take the time to go through all of these in detail, but I do want to talk about them briefly. You do need to choose an audience, and I recommend starting out with an audience of one, and the audience is one project. I also recommend starting out by standing on the shoulders of giants. Do not start creating a component library from scratch. Instead, just go pick one that already exists. My clients I'm currently working with, one of them is using Material UI, another one of them is using React Bootstrap, another one is using Ant Design. All of those are fine starting points. Recognize that it may seem silly, but on day one, all of their component libraries were merely wrapping those open source projects. So you might ask yourself, but why? Why are they wrapping open source projects? Well, the answer is because their APIs are already vetted and sound, and what we'll add value on is theming that to our needs, changing the styles as we need, and also removing settings and hard coding settings based on our company opinions. So we will slowly move away from their APIs, but to get started right away, add that abstraction. And once you've done that, then yeah, over time you can do new releases and you've started there. And then there's nothing wrong with slowly maybe forking some of their code, grabbing another open source project. Virtually every component library that I work with is a mutt. And by mutt, I mean it's a mixture of, well, we started with this open source component library, and then we grabbed some other libraries, then we wrote some, then we forked this code. So it's a mixture of a lot of different things. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. Because again, good developers are lazy. We want to go use other people's stuff wherever possible. That's a big win to do that sort of thing. So the idea of audience is going to escalate over time. You're going to start with a project, and then you're going to move to a team, move to a business, and finally maybe go open source. I have yet to open source any of the component libraries I'm working with. I wish I could because there's cool stuff in there, but that thus far has been the hurdle. Oddly, I did have one that was open source for a while, and then we closed sourced it. I don't know how you put the cat back in the bag, but we did. Yeah. But slowly going wider does escalate things. It gives you more people that you need to deal with and worry about. Okay, I also want to talk briefly about flexibility because there's all these different things that you might want to make configurable. And if you're going to write components that people actually use, that are truly reusable, you've got to balance programmatically enforcing consistency with providing flexibility for all the use cases. And that's really difficult. Now that means there's going to be times that you make the wrong bet. And oddly, I'm going to suggest this. I like to start out very rigid. And the reason that you want an API that's rigid is because it makes it's easy to add settings later, but it's very difficult to remove them later. We know this in general in code. Like we've added in features before in our applications, and then nobody uses them, you think, and then you try to remove it and somebody screams, and you got to put it back in. Even though 1% of your users use this feature, they get mad, and now you got to keep it. So by starting out with a very lean API that only does a few things, it's less code, it's easier to understand. So oddly, I think that's preferable. If you want people to use your stuff, start out simple, they'll understand what it is, and hopefully they'll ask you if it doesn't do exactly what they need it to do. But it is a spectrum, and there are trade-offs between these two approaches. But recognize that when I show what's good about the flexible side, that's a short list. I mean, the list on the left with a rigid and inflexible component, there's a lot of benefits on that side. And the risk with flexibility in general is the idea of the tragedy of the commons, that individuals tend to behave contrary to the common good. So you're going to have somebody coming up to you all the time saying, can you add this extra feature that nobody else is going to want, but it helps me out? And you go, well, that's not good for the community, that's not good for all the users, but we could try to scratch your itch. I'd also say for the people that are on the reusable component team, it requires a certain fit. Like you need to have somebody who's disagreeable. And I don't mean that they're rude, but I do mean that they are okay with saying no to people. And they're okay with saying, I know that you want that, but we have to honor the fact that it doesn't make sense here. Instead, you may want to fork this component, take the source code, do what you need, but we're not going to put it in the project. And I have to do that a lot. And if I've seen atrophy occur, the atrophy tends to occur because agreeable developers join the team, and whatever product asks for, or whatever design asks for, or whatever some developer asks for, they just quietly do it. There has to be somebody in control of the API. There has to be somebody with a true vision to say, I have to think about the big picture in the long term, because if I don't, things are going to get worse over time. I also want to show this is much ado about, this is really related to TypeScript, but it's a demo I wanted to get in, and I've got to switch my mirror again. Hopefully they'll get this fixed here soon. Okay. I told you I'm a fan of TypeScript. So back to this bandwagon for a second. Who's using TypeScript? Good. I don't have to do much of a sales pitch there. So in TypeScript, one thing that I learned fairly recently that I love is that I can programmatically enforce mutually exclusive props, which is a fancy way of saying I can make sure that you can't set invalid combinations. So sometimes you get into this issue where you might have a prop that if this prop is enabled, this other thing over here should always be disabled. Now that's a sign that your API might need to be changed. That can sometimes be a sign that it should be two separate components, because you could argue it's doing two different things. But I do want to show, so we have this tile component, and the tile is basically a square with a shadow behind it. That's about it. Some would call it a card, but we call it a tile because it's square, not big and rectangular. But when you render a tile on the page, it could be a div, which uses these props. It could be rendered as an anchor, which uses these props, or it could be rendered as a button. So we have three different interfaces, but what I want to point out here is the props for tile use these three potential props as a union. So let's look at these props so I can show you how this works. So a div prop can never have an href or an action on it. It also can never have a click handler. It wouldn't make sense to have a click on a div. If we come down here to anchor, then notice, okay, yeah, you can have an href, but you cannot have an on-click on anchor. Down here on button, you can have an on-click, but you can never have an href. So this experience, if I come over to some other component, let me just open any other file. We'll open card.tsx. Let's go here. And I'm going to come in. And I'm going to try to call tile right here. So I'll import tile. And I'm going to put the href equal to an invalid URL, but bear with me here. So I just put the href in. Now that I put the href in, I can go ahead, I could try to put an on-click. Say maybe on-click I want to alert hi here. Now notice once I do, it's going to get cranky. TypeScript will help me out. TypeScript knows that I can't do this. Oh, I do need CTA and icon. So here, let me put CTA, do this. CTA stands for call to action. And now, gotten rid of that one. So the message that I get here, I feel like could be better from TypeScript, but I am programmatically now unable to put an on-click on here. Now if I take this href off, I can do an on-click, but now I have to put other things on. So I am programmatically enforced to only put in certain combinations. I want to show one other example because this is an interesting conversation and I'm curious how you all have handled it. What I want to show is a new component that we just built a few days ago that implements, I'm going to zoom back a little, it implements basically an IM user interface here. So this looks a lot like text messaging between two people. Now, the way that this works, let me show how we code this up. You come down here in code, and we have a message component that you put in. And then notice that the way that this is displayed is you can have a sender on the right-hand side and a receiver over here on the left-hand side. For sender, we don't show an avatar. For receiver, we do. For receiver, we also show who sent it and at what time. And we also have this option of showing that it's in progress. So the problem that you run into is some of the props only apply to the receiver, and other props only apply to the sender. So a simple solution that I proposed for this, and I'm curious what you all think of it, is to have a grouping of the props that only apply to remote by putting them under an object called remote props. So if remote props is set, we know that it's a remote message. If remote props isn't set, we know it's a local message. And by grouping these together, you've got to set them all if they're there, or you set none of them. TypeScript will enforce that. So this is another example of, to get people to use your components, it also helps to avoid the paper cuts, to give them feedback, to make sure that they can't do something that's truly impossible. Instead of runtime errors, give them compile time errors. So I'm curious if anybody has solved this problem in a different way, where you have related props that really all need to be set at the same time. Yeah, go ahead.
You could instead just have two components that wrap that base internal component.
Yes, and that was the other one we considered, was to have two components. We could have a remote component and a local component. The only downside is then you have to jump between two pages when you're actually implementing it, and the docs would otherwise be the same for the two. So there's some trade-offs there, and in fact what I just described, since these are custom docs, I could probably make that feel pretty integrated. Also, I didn't mention this, but these are custom docs, but they are programmatically generated. So if you look at this component, what you'll notice is the props all have these comments sitting up above right here. And those comments are actually displayed within the app itself. These prop tables that you see right here, this is pulled off of the code comments. This type is read by a project called React DocGen. There are similar projects for other libraries out there. So recognize it's not that I have to manually keep the docs and the code in sync. They're programmatically in sync. This ties in with what Kent said this morning. It's solved. Like, I don't have to think about it. It is fixed by design. So the other nice thing about this is I know that these comments are also useful in code. So now as a developer, I can come in here and see, oh, okay, now I know exactly what this means. And they'll also display for people. So it's a double win. In the same token, even above the components themselves, you will see, if I come over here and open up tile. Oh wait, I'm sorry, not tile. Let me open card right here. You'll see that not just the card props are commented, but also the comment up above the component. Notice this comment. It says cards are used to group like information, yada yada. Well, if I come over here to the card component, that's what displays right here. So programmatically implementing docs is a wonderful way to get people to use your stuff, save you time along the way. Okay, so we're down to the wire. I'm curious. What were you hoping I'd talk about that I haven't yet? Because I got about 5 minutes. Yeah?
You said flexible to rigid. And I mean, I've heard of systems as rigid as like you're not allowed to write CSS. Where do you, like, that's kind of like the golden line where I'm like, past that, opposite is pretty orthodox. Where do you lie there?
So basically his question is, what about styling? How flexible should you be about styling? This is as close to a religious conversation as I've had in this space. Because styling is divisive anyway, because there's so many ways to do styling right now. But I have clients that are internally torn about this, because recognize that I could write my styles in a way that is very open to extension. And in fact, this library is written that way. If I come in here and look at this card component, what you'll see is the styles, although they have long names right here, all the styles follow BEM. If you're not familiar with BEM, it stands for Block Element Modifier. So the block, in React at least, is the component's name, which is heading. And then the modifier could be something like a subsection right here. So this example, these are very open to somebody else styling it. And we've deliberately designed it that way because we decided to do that. One of my other clients said, no. We don't want people messing with styles, so we actually make it more difficult. You end up being very specific in the selectors. You put in inline styles sometimes. You slap importance where it's really important. And this is the thing though, is developers are developers. They can get around it either way. So all you're doing is annoying them in the end. So when you try to enforce consistency through CSS, there's only so far you can go before people go, no, I can go farther. And keep in mind, one of the things they can always choose to do is not use your component at all. So this rigid thing can certainly go too far. And your styling question, I continue to be torn about that because I have seen it go both ways. I've seen it cut and also help. And that's the very nature of reusable components. If they're done well, then lots of people use them, like I had the experience at AutoTrader. And if they're not done well, then at one of my other clients, what happens is people just grab something off the internet and use it instead. And that's where they were. Okay, so like 4 minutes left. I'm going to just briefly wrap up by jumping to the end. I had 100 slides, and I deliberately talked instead because I had things that I felt like were more important than the slides. But I will tweet out a link to the slides after if you're interested in reading through the rest. The slides also are written in a way that you can read them and get the information. I do have a course out on Pluralsight that is called Creating Reusable React Components. Most of the stuff I talk in there would be fairly relevant to anybody creating a component library. I also have a bunch of other courses out there on React, on C#, careers as well. My full-time gig is independence. I like to joke with my kids that I'm unemployed. But the fact is I travel around and I train teams and do consulting on React. That is my thing. So you can reach me at reactjsconsulting.com. I also tweet way too much. And if you go out to Twitter now, you'll get to see, I just learned how to ride a one wheel because Kent shared his at lunch. I'm bad, like real bad, but I didn't get hurt at least. I will be up here to visit more, happy to answer questions, but thank you all for coming. Enjoy the conference. See ya.